quick question. What's harder, creating generational wealth or keeping the family from turning on each other at the next Thanksgiving meal? Today, we're going to be talking about managing generational wealth, why the founder playbook is no longer applicable, and replacing it with a new playbook on how to manage generational wealth. Hey everyone, Tommy Durfler, Sam Rice here with Lighthouse Wealth Group, the Spotlight Podcast. Today, we're going to be talking about managing generational wealth. So this is going to be the second part of our three-part series regarding generational wealth. The first part we talked about, of course, creating the generational wealth, which we refer to as Gen 1, the first generation. In this case, we're going to be talking about managing it for the second generation.
That's right. So as we move from the first to the second generation, the biggest thing we see, since that owner playbook does not really apply anymore, is the operator shift from the second generation to now an owner and investor and manager of that wealth. And how do we do that, Tommy? You want to talk about a little bit about that?
Yeah, and to back up for a second, it's really important to understand why that playbook doesn't work anymore from the first generation. In the first generation, they're moving fast, they're taking risks, and they kind of rule by the iron fist, right? It's do as I say. Then things start to slow down because you've already created something sustainable, most likely in the form of a private business or a real estate empire or something to that nature. But the second generation is more of, okay, it's not because I said so, but it's because we all agreed so, referring to the siblings, of course. So, in that situation, the siblings have to really get together and learn how to manage this. And a lot of that entails the personalities, who decides, who advises, who wants to be a part of this, who simply just wants to be informed. And when you have an initial family meeting with this, you'll find that there's a lot of different personalities and different roles that people want to take on. And so I think you kind of have to get that out on the table first to decide a lot of those roles that the siblings want to take.
Yep. And with those roles, you set up some type of rules, right, within a family.
Yeah. And I think that will come on as far as with each family is a little bit different. So you kind of have different rules,
Sure.
Different families, but I think, making sure that, hey, who are the advisors? Who is the estate planning attorney? Who is the wealth manager? Who is the banker that the family dealt with or, the first generation dealt with? But I think the real case is making sure that you are getting together every so often with the family members to be able to decide those different roles. Because really,
That's right.
The first generation is running on pure instinct. The second generation runs on pure agreements. So they have to have structure in place. They have to have rules in place to be able to say, how do we make decisions based on this? And,
Yes.
First generation never had to deal with that,
No, they were just go, go, go.
Go, do as I say, and then,
Yep.
Like I said before, once you start creating something, it's more of, okay, that's already been done. Now, how do we learn to manage this? And so you have to have certain house rules, certain things like what do we do with distributions? If it's a private equity firm and there's dividends or income being spread out, what does that look like? How often do you want to do that? Some family members are fine getting just a lump sum once a year. Some other family members might not be as responsible, and they say, hey, if I just get one distribution per year, then they might spend it too quickly.
Yeah.
And so in their case,
2 months.
Yeah. So in their case, they might want to spread it out over time to really making sure they're not becoming their own worst enemy on that. But I think starting to have that structure in place really helps know who's managing it, who's deciding, and who's staying informed.
Yeah, and I think setting that up prior to that actual transition from Gen 1 to Gen 2 So it's not a surprise to people, and people are eased into it over time is also key, right? Education from one generation to the next, growing up with awareness, with responsibility for these things that we've been bequested, is key to understanding how to responsibly manage them. So we've got the Gen 1, Gen 2 transition, who's going to be running it, a set of rules, and what do those set of rules kind of guide us, Tommy? How we help continue this legacy going forward?
Yeah, great question. So the set of rules, Gen 2 is going to be faced with a whole new set of circumstances and questions. And so a lot of it is going to be, okay, we have something sustainable. Like I said, most of the time it's in the form of a private business. But how much is enough for each family member? So the spending rule, how much do we want to be able to take off our investments or the business or whatever it may be for our lifestyles, understanding that for number one, and every family is going to be a little bit different and have different needs and different wants as well. But having a little bit of those objectives and a spending rule is really key. And yes, if you have generational wealth, you can overspend. So a budget still applies in this case, but making sure you know what spending limits are for each one of the families. The other thing that I think that could possibly come up is if once you have the spending limits, knowing what the money is used for. So now it could be that there are higher distributions than what the siblings need in total. So what do you do with that? Where do you deploy that money? And it could be saying, hey, maybe we want to diversify. Maybe we want to invest in other businesses. And, what does that look like? That de-risks the family wealth. So you're not just having your main source of wealth coming from one place. You might want to start diversifying and looking at investing passively in other businesses. And so now that brings up a whole nother set of governance of what does that look like? Obviously
investment, governments.
Yeah. And so just knowing what that looks like, whether it's liquidity issue, hey, do we want this to be liquid money that we can go ahead and sell at any point? Do we want to look at other investments such as real estate, something that's typically not as liquid, that's locked up for a period of time. And then same thing with private equity. Mm-hmm. Do we want to lock this money up for a certain period of time? Do you not? And so that breeds that question as far as, hey, how much concentration do we want to have in just one thing, or do we want to start diversifying?
Yeah. And then who gets to make those decisions?
Mm-hmm. That's right. So in generation one, you kind of won by just running on gut or instinct. Generation two really wins more by policy.
Yeah, it's almost like you've got to have a bit more thought in it, right? You don't have this driver from the first generation. Now you've got something that's worth quite a bit of money in most cases, and how do we not screw this up?
Yeah.
Now that we've got a good thing.
And I've seen, this go several different ways with a lot of families in the second generation. It could be that the siblings are not getting along. Maybe there's a lot of conflict. There needs to be something, hopefully, regarding conflict resolution. What happens when the siblings don't agree? And a lot of times what I've seen is that they will actually sell the business, and then they'll split up the wealth into each family. And so that was one thing I saw with one family is they just said, hey, we can't agree on this. Let's just go ahead and sell our shares or sell our ownership. And that way each family can go do what they want with their own wealth. And they don't have to agree anymore, right? If they're not bound by the one thing. I've also seen it where some families
they're
agree
not
to
relying on that one business.
Yeah. I've also seen it where a family says, hey, listen, we're going to have a really good lifestyle to make sure that all of our wants and needs are taken care of, but we're going to start investing as a family in something new together. And that was pretty cool because it actually bound the family and saying, hey,
that's exciting.
yeah, we're not just bound by something that, mom and dad did, but now we have a little bit more purpose in bringing us together to say, hey, now we get to diversify into something else. And that creates a lot of energy within the siblings too. And so that was really cool just to see that as well, saying, hey, let's invest in something else. You're de-risking, and, you're growing closer as a family, and, you get to do kind of a new venture to some degree.
Something you can actively participate in together, and it's not so, who does what, not trying to keep this, business from the first generation alive, because that's a hard part too. I mean, if that patriarch from the first generation is no longer around, unless somebody's stepping up to the plate, one of the kids, that's a really big, weight to put on potentially an outside person to come act as CEO, but that person supporting a family with this business. So yeah, in a lot of cases, it does make sense to have that liquidity event. So it's everyone's on an equal playing field, taking the cards off the table kind of thing.
Well, that brings up a good point, because fair is not always equal, and equal is not always fair, right? And so when you start getting into something where you have some siblings want to be an active participant within the business, maybe they really enjoy it, and somebody else says, hey, I don't really want to be an active participant, I want to be a passive owner, then you start going down those discussions as far as, what is fair. And those are hard conversations, but the more you can have those conversations on the front end, hopefully you can get to a point of resolution. It doesn't always mean it's going to happen, because you're dealing with people, and, people are emotional and there's conflict, but, hopefully you get to that point.
That's right. And then, so we've got a gentleman who put together a really great book and some literature on generational wealth, family wealth, called The 5 Forms of Capital. You want to talk a little bit about that, Tommy?
Yeah, Jay Hughes, great author, written great books about this. And he talks about how families endure generational wealth. And one of the things they do is they invest in 5 key areas, what he calls the 5 forms of capital. The first form, of course, is human capital, investing in people, making sure that, the families stay healthy, they're educated, they have a sense of purpose. The second thing is intellectual capital, which are things like financial literacy, governance literacy, decision making. How do we make decisions? And making sure that, they're investing in that education. The other thing is social capital. How do we invest in trusting each other? Reputational equity. How do we make sure that, whatever we're doing has a certain sense of purpose within the social community? Spiritual capital, making sure we have shared values and missions. What is the money to be used for? What's this wealth to be used for? And then, of course, financial capital, which is the combination of all the other 4, right? And so if you only focus on one area and you neglect the 4 other areas, then typically you're not going to see an enduring family know how to really handle the generational wealth. And so a lot of times people just concentrate on the money aspect of it, right? The financial capital. And if you do that, eventually it becomes the weakest capital if you do that. And so really knowing how to invest in those 5 key areas will just help you and your family be aware of what it takes to be able to manage something.
That's right. Yeah, you can't have all of it without the other structures that support one another. And then lastly, we've talked a little bit about these roles and responsibilities. Obviously, family wealth can be a dynamic and often very interesting situation for a lot of families to kind of step into, right? There's a lot of stuff on the table. You've got family dynamics. And so you want to talk a little bit about a couple different ways in which you can help, set your right foot forward into help mitigating risk within a family and conflict before you get there?
Yeah. Um, I think having a mission statement and a value system is key. Um, ideally what you want to have is the first generation doing that. That's not very common for them to do that just because they're too busy living it. And so, if you can get the first generation to help with this in the form of telling a story, right? If somebody came to me and said, "Hey, write down a mission statement and your core values," it'd be like, okay, that's pretty heavy. But if somebody came to me and said, "Hey, I'd love to hear your story. How'd you get started? What, when starting this business, and tell me about that," that's much easier for me, right? Because it's part of who I am, and then you start to glean the true mission, the values, and so on. And I think if generation 2 really helps with that and can draw that out the first generation, hopefully when they're alive, that helps tremendously start to craft that. And so understanding the purpose of the money as well, and understanding, hey, what is this for? And getting that very structured as much as you can, knowing that it doesn't have to be perfect, but getting that kind of on paper, something that you can communicate, certainly helps with just that alone. Because it gives that deeper sense of purpose.
What were those ideals and values? Yeah, that got us here in the first place.
Yeah. A second thing is having a good cadence with family meetings. And so a lot of times what I'll hear is, we don't even know where to start. How do you do that? Well, you want to have a facilitator start it. Don't think that this is something that has to be done within the family itself, of somebody has to step up and be that facilitator. You want to really have an outside facilitator, someone like a wealth advisor, somebody that works in a family office. There are people that are very
attorney, something
estate planning attorney. There are credentialed people out there that can help facilitate that. But having a normal cadence with that certainly helps. And I think the one big takeaway there is to say, okay, hey, we're not going to try to figure this all out in one meeting. We're going to be able to say, hey, we're going to have quarterly meetings, and where we can get together, have an agenda, discuss it as a family, have facilitator. And really what I've seen is it kind of morphs into its own thing. And that's when it's like, okay, now it's personalized. But I think people that don't do that
cool
don't
now.
Commit to that, really are missing out. And it could be just as, hey, we don't know how to take the first step. And so we always tell people, hey, it's not about, you don't have to have this perfect meeting in the beginning or have it all figured out after the first meeting. Just take that first step, have that cadence, and hopefully if everybody's committed to the process, you'll start to see some traction.
Yeah. And I mean, what a great way to bring a family together, just, as an excuse maybe to go on vacation together, get everyone in town, that kind of thing, to learn about their family, what got them here, what this has turned into, really, because typically it started from a business and it turns into another business, which is just managing the family wealth or 100%. Purpose or mission, what have you, within the family. Yeah.
And a lot of times, depending on how much wealth you have, right? I mean, there's people that just start out and saying, hey, listen, we do have wealth that should last, a couple of generations, but, and maybe they start small with something and then it grows. And then you've seen the opposite, like the Vanderbilts are a good example of that. They had massive, massive, massive wealth. And, there's that famous story of the Vanderbilts getting together to have a family reunion. I think it was in 1973, and none of them were millionaires anymore.
Oh, wow.
And so
really,
we want to try to avoid that as much as possible by having, this governance, the system, the processes, the people vested, the purpose, the mission, the values, to make sure we avoid that type of situation.
Yeah, and I think, honestly, in most cases, we're talking about generational wealth, large sum of money, but these are great things to do to start with your family at any wealth or income level. What a great excuse to educate your family, different different understandings and levels of wealth, and, help become stewards of their own assets going forward.
Yeah, that's a good point, because all this boils down to is your relationship with money. And if you see money as something that you have to steward, and there's a certain responsibility behind there, then we find that you're usually set up for success. That is, rather than something that it's like, hey, I have this now, I get to spend it, and I get all these things you want. And I think we've all heard the stories of celebrities or athletes that gobble up, the money that they get because they never had it, right? And so it's kind of like being deprived of something, and all of a sudden you get it and you just want to spend it. Where I think there has to be a healthy relationship with money through things like financial literacy that help you understand, hey, yes, money can bring you these things, but you have to understand what it can't do either. It can't bring that happiness. So obviously people of wealth and that generational wealth, they're thrust into this to some degree in the early generations. Mm-hmm. Now you start talking about generation 8, 9, 10, that's a different story. We're not talking about that per se. But when you have people that are thrust into the situation, they have to learn these things very, very quickly. And that's what makes it difficult.
It can be jarring.
And then you have to keep it going. So the way I always describe it is kind of like, first generation created a creek. They created something that they were able to go grab water from when they needed it, right? And so their fear was, hey, is this creek going to dry up? Let's keep this creek flowing as much as possible. If we need water, we can go get water as we need it. And now the second generation is say, okay, hey, this creek is now starting to flow. And how do we make it a river? Now it's not I'm afraid to some degree that it's going to dry up. Now it's, hey, what's the purpose of this river? Yes, if we need water, let's go to the water as necessary and get ourselves some water, But it might be a situation where it's, hey, how do we feed other people? Or how do we do things for others knowing that we're taken care of? And that's going to be different for every family.
Yeah, that's powerful. Yeah. How can we enrich the lives of others with something we've become a steward of?
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so that's ultimately what this comes down to, is us trying to help people understand that, help them set up for success as much as possible. Because listen, these things aren't easy. We all think of the Vanderbilts, the Rockefellers, the Rothschilds, and you think of the modern day versions of those, with Elon and Zuckerberg and all these other major businesses. And they really, to some degree, they probably think about it more than most, but they have a heavier responsibility. They really do. And so if we can help bring that to people's attention, I think there's a lot more higher probability, I should say, of success, making sure that you don't go, from shirt sleeves to shirt sleeves in 3 generations. So I would say, to wrap everything up as kind of a summary, what we wanted to do was just touch on the things that we've seen people have success with. We really wanted to just educate our viewers on, hey, this is the start of it. Obviously, there's so many variations of what we just talked about. Every family is going to be different. Every family is going to be very unique in the way they approach these things. But ultimately, what we want to do is make sure that we help people understand, hey, there is a difference between the 2 generations. Generation 1, the playbook is very different than generation 2. And then, hopefully what we'll talk about in our 3rd series, which is, okay, how does the 3rd generation continue that? How do they leave that generational wealth? What are their responsibilities? So we just hope everybody enjoyed this. And again, this is the 2nd of our 3-part series. You'll see the 3rd part coming out here shortly. I just want to thank everybody for listening. And if you have any questions, please like, subscribe, and then check out our website at www.lighthousewealthgroup.com. We'll see everyone on the next one.
Bye, guys.